Welcome everybody. This is a Beam Exchange Grab the Mic webinar. My name is Mike Albu. I am director of the Beam Exchange, and we create this space so that practitioners can share their experiences and their learnings, their lessons, and their insights from the practice of market systems development. And today I'm very glad we've got three very interesting and articulate speakers. Holly Krueger, who is the managing partner of the Canopy Lab, Reema Shrestha from Swisscontact, and Isuri Munasinghe who is the Research Impact Measurement and Inclusion Coordinator for the Market Development Facility, which is a multi-donor program working in multiple countries, but she is the coordinator in Sri Lanka. And they're going to be talking about how to achieve meaningful inclusion, social and gender, in market systems development. So they're going to speak for 30 minutes, then we're going to have some questions and answers. Please feel free to put questions to the speaker in the Q&A box. Please introduce yourself or put any other kind of chat you want to in the chat area. And I'll be back to moderate the Q&A in 30 minutes. So I'm very happy. I'll hand over to actually introduce the topic to Holly. Holly, please.
There. Thanks a lot, Mike. Hi, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with you today. But before I dive into the findings from our conversation series, I want to start with a short story. I have been in the GESI and market systems development space for a very long time. And starting a few years back, I began to notice that GESI in market systems development or economic growth conferences was getting less and less attention. And in a few notable cases was even left off the agenda entirely. At the same time, I was hearing at these events from practitioners that programs know how to do this. We don't really need to discuss it anymore. They have this in hand. I will admit this sparked a healthy bit of skepticism, but also a real genuine curiosity to look more closely. Yes, it has been almost 2 decades since the first guidance on women's economic empowerment in market systems development was published. And yes, there is now a strong and very impressive cadre of GESI specialists across the sector. But the question I kept coming back to was this: have we invested enough at the right levels? And most importantly, is this infrastructure and expertise actually translating into meaningful GESI outcomes in MSD programs? I didn't want to be dismissive of the progress because objectively there's been a lot of it. But it mattered to me that we honestly evaluate the distance still to travel, especially because the finish line keeps moving. I wanted to take stock of how the GESI practice has matured technically, the shocks it has weathered in the past couple of years, and what those pressures mean for the future of this work. So after consultation with several peers, the GESI and MSD conversation series was born. To give shape to the conversation, we structured it across 3 sessions. Each was aligned to a different moment in the evolution of GESI and MSD. The first session looked back at where we came from. The second session focused on where we are today. And the third session looked ahead to where we are going. And in this session, we asked the important question: what is needed to deliver stronger GESI outcomes going forward? The series was deliberately practitioner-focused, and it brought together more than 400 participants from a geographically diverse range of context. I will admit I was amazed at the scale of participation. I did not even realize that there was 400 of us in this world, 400 GESI and MSD practitioners out there. But I think the scale of the participation was a real testament to the importance and the timeliness of this discussion. The series has also been guided by an amazing 21-member advisory group, which spans donors, NGOs, projects, and consultants. Because we wanted to make sure that the findings was relevant to the MSD community, but also had broader resonance as well, and economic growth in trade sectors. So what did we learn? Well, the first thing we learned is that the field has genuinely moved forward. but not far enough, and at every moment it continues to face headwinds. So through the conversation series, we reviewed over 20 years of women's economic empowerment and GESI technical guidance. And the shift was striking. Both the technical approach and the ambition of inclusion has expanded. In terms of scope alone, and as a small anecdotal example, my own title has changed several times over even the course of 5 years, from Women's Economic Empowerment Advisor to Gender Advisor to GESI Advisor to a GESI Advisor, and this was all just in one program. And at the Canopy Lab, we call our practice the Inclusion Plus practice in anticipation of any further changes to the scope, because we know it will expand. And in terms of the technical approach, we found that early efforts focused on access to credit, markets, and training, but too often they overlooked important things like agency, social norms, and structural barriers. We also found that as the field matured, programs began measuring empowerment more meaningfully, addressing systemic constraints, and embedding inclusion into core economic strategies. Practitioners, however, also recognize the limits of mainstreaming GESI alone. And this has led to a twin track approach that combines both systems change with targeted support. More recently, there's been a growing recognition that inclusion is intersectional, and bringing additional lenses is vital to doing this work well. So we found that today, inclusion is no longer just about access, it is about voice, relevance, and agency. The second finding is that GESI work is unfolding under intense and often contradictory conditions. In some settings, it faces growing scrutiny, constrained mandates, or even active rollback. Yet in others, most notably in Australian-funded programs, there is a genuine momentum and push to do more and do better. But this comes with its own set of challenges, including how to ensure that approaches to gender equality, disability equity, and social inclusion reflect best practice and are delivered in a way that resonates with practitioners and ultimately the private sector. Each context is creating its own set of pressures. One of the most striking findings from the entire series was the level of consensus on what it takes to do good GESI work. Participants remained remarkably aligned, saying that delivering quality GESI work requires both hard and soft infrastructure. And we term these the non-negotiables. So the first non-negotiable, this is visible leadership. Visible leadership support matters. And we're talking about sustained public backing that gives teams permission to push boundaries and protection when resistance arises. When leaders signal that inclusion is core to program strategies, teams act with greater confidence. This includes resourcing, follow-through, and standing firm when inclusion work challenges power or politics. The second non-negotiable is that GESI must be integrated across program systems. This should have been obvious for us systems thinkers. We're talking about strong programs embedded in design, staffing, MEL, procurement, and performance management. They work for one shared system that is supported by cross-functional buy-in and adaptive practice. And the third is around flexible resourcing. This is essential. It's not just about funding. Funding is important, but it's also about flexibility, time, and expertise, because we know that norm change work is slow and the resources need to account for this. We call these the non-negotiables because this is what GESI experts know is needed to deliver stronger GESI outcomes and more sustainable market systems going forward. So I'm now going to invite my colleague Reema from Swisscontact to share her experience from NAMDP translating some of these non-negotiables into practice. So over to you, Reema. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. I'm Reema Shrestha. I was the team leader for an STC-funded project, NAMDP, here in Nepal, implemented by Swisscontact over the last 5 years. So we officially closed NAMDP in December 2025. NAMDP was a market system development project, and we aim to make smallholder farmers and agribusiness more competitive by removing key market barriers. So when it comes to GESI, I mean, GESI for NMDP, it was not just an add-on. It was there from the beginning. When we selected the sector, the priority sectors on agriculture, GESI was one of the core criteria. And also the specific geographical locations where we worked, particular locations where women, discriminated groups were there. So we also worked on those areas. So our ambition when we looked at GESI was to make the agriculture system more inclusive. And when we looked at it, we worked through improving access to services, increasing income and employment opportunities for men, women, discriminated groups, and also strengthening the enabling environment. So when we implemented NMDP project, one of the key lessons from NMDP in case of GESI was like GESI has to be planned from the design itself. If you want to make GESI transformative project, then it has to be started from the design phase itself. So when we started NMDP 5 years back, it started as a GESI sensitive project. Our main focus was improving access to services for women and discriminated groups through the MSD project. And with income increase, growth and job creation. So these were our key targets for the project. And when you look at it, there have been several interventions where we did support GESI transformation. But when when the project focused more on GESI sensitive project, when we looked at it, there was areas where we couldn't make a lot of changes at the agency level. We realized we hadn't gone very far when it comes to agency. The access was there, they were getting income increase. But when you looked at the agency and voice, that was something we saw missing in the project. And in the 5 years time frame, we also saw donor expectation changing from being part of being a sensitive project. They wanted more of a transformation project. And that was something we realized that the things are changing. And we cannot only focus on making access to resources was not enough. We needed voice agency. So with that in mind, we had a internal GESI assessment in mid of the project. And when we did that, we realized that agency and voice was missing. So to bring that, we had an adaptive management. We made some changes in the project. And one of the case was we worked with one of the women's group, women-led organization who were engaged in collective marketing and branding of products for women entrepreneurs. So when we partner with this company, they were focusing not only on the production and market access of the products, but also focus on the leadership for women development, market trends, digital marketing. So they were all of soft skills was also part of the whole partnership. So what this did was it strengthened the women's agency voice within the market system. So we realized that just having neutral interventions is not enough. You have to have some market targeted interventions as well. And there are areas where you also need to work with organizations like women-led organizations, maybe cooperatives, this kind of organization, along with the private sector and public sector. So that was one of the lessons learned we had. And we also realized that when we had our first original log frame, we only had quantitative indicators on GESI, just disaggregated data. But we realized that was not enough for the project. We also needed qualitative indicators that can allow us to capture changes that numbers alone couldn't explain. So that was something we made changes while implementing the project. The other very important lessons, which I feel it's very important for project management perspective also, is our ownership. GESI cannot just sit with just one person. We cannot have one focal person as a GESI person and expect that person to do everything. If that happens, then GESI it stays isolated. It will not be part of the system of the project. So we made a very conscious effort to make sure GESI was everyone's responsibility. We even had the team members, all the program teams, TOR revised with GESI as one of the responsibility. We also had refresher orientation sessions to the whole team, including even our public and private partners, to make sure that GESI was important and part of the project implementation. And GESI was not part of, GESI was always a part of our sector reviews meeting, everyday conversation, and not just on special sessions. So what this taught us was GESI transformation is a process. It takes time. It involves lots of trial and errors. And sometimes it may go beyond the life of a project. I mean, project being in a very short span, we can expect everything to change in that project. But sometimes if these interventions can give results beyond the life of the project and project as well. So when it's designed, projects are designed intentionally and owned collectively, it can start changing the mindset of people. So it's not just the system. So I think it's very important that for the project, for it to be a GESI transformative project, mindsets has to shift and have to look beyond just the numbers to more agency and voice. So yeah, I think these are some of the learnings we had while implementing GESI in our project. So yeah, I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussions. Yeah, thank you,
Thank you
Holly.
so much for sharing your own examples. I think what really resonates with me is this focus on embedding it in the system. And you had the experience where you had to pivot kind of midway, but really because this is hard work, because it takes time, getting it right from the outset is critical. I think that's one really important piece here. And I like
Yeah.
also, I think the second lesson that you have around shared ownership is also critical. And I see this, and I want to tie this to the first non-negotiable that we had around leadership, because I think leaders play an instrumental role in encouraging that shared ownership across teams and making it not just your JETSI specialist job, but the job of the entire team. And the signals, both vocal and non-vocal from a leader, I think really set the tone for a project about whether there's going to be that shared ownership or not. But I agree with you. We can't achieve the types of ambitious JETSI programming that we want and need for sustainable market systems change without the whole team pulling in the same direction.
Yeah,
Thank you for
absolutely.
sharing.
Yeah, Ollie, totally agree. I mean, leadership and the top management plays a very important role. Then they have to be part of this. I mean, if they don't have this buy-in, then it's very difficult for a project to implement and focus, making sure it's an inclusive delivery of interventions. Yeah.
I also love that you touched on monitoring and evaluation. So I'm going to use that as a bridge to bring in Isuri from the NDF program in Sri Lanka to talk about, a lot on monitoring and evaluation, as that is her role on the program, but also how some of these non-negotiables show up in her work. So over to you, Isuri.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Beam Exchange, for this opportunity. Just a bit about MDF, Market Development Facility. We are a multi-country project funded by the Australian government. Our main focus is working with the private sector to really unlock some unmet growth opportunities in key sectors for our countries. In Sri Lanka specifically, we have tourism and agriculture and export crops like coffee that we heavily work in. And sometimes those are really tough sectors to bring a conversation like inclusion in GETSI to a private sector partner. So we've always had this focus of bringing a business case, and we've had the mill team in the past bringing that lens when a design comes through and really conveying those stories to the donor to explain this is the kind of impact we've had. But of course, like Reema and Holly mentioned, the goalpost keeps changing, the expectations keep rising. So with this, like Reema touched upon it, making it a shared responsibility was really important. So really picking up the team's capacity to identify opportunities in the field, hiring JETSI specialists, appointing focals so that the conversation is stronger inside the office. And then when they go to the field, they're able to identify these opportunities. And rather than sitting in office, thinking of a design, a concept note, and trying to figure out, okay, how do I make this more inclusive? We sort of did more research. We strengthened the research we did before going into design. See a need, feel a need. So really talk to the community to understand where are their gaps, where are their lacking opportunities, and then using that hard evidence to take it back to the private sector partner and be like, here's an opportunity you're not missing. If we move on to the next slide, I can talk about two case studies where this worked really well. Sustainable tourism. I mean, tourism is a tough sector to have work MSD in. And most people forget that sustainable tourism actually is not just about greening the industry, it's also about making it more inclusive. And a real unique problem we have in Sri Lanka is that only 10% of our staff working population in tourism accounts for women. And there is also high turnover, both women, men, youth. So bringing this conversation with the private sector has been difficult because it's like, oh, this is tough. We have to accept certain realities when it comes to this sector. But then we started off by, okay, let's ask the industry, let's ask the people working in the industry and people not working in the industry as well. We did a women in tourism study. And in that, we found that, yes, there is stigma. Yes, there is working condition issues. Yes, there's working hours. But also there are women out there who are like, but what opportunities are out there in tourism? I actually don't know. And how this varied geographically. And that sort of sparked a conversation. So using opportunities like this, platforms, high profile platforms, to bring this very poignant one or two facts to start a conversation helped. This followed on with a recent airport survey findings and analysis we spoke about. We had a release of data. And an interesting finding was that 60% of arrivals to Sri Lanka are women. So if your sector only hires 10% of women, there's a disconnect there. So again, using those platforms and using those events to really hit the nail and say, look, there's something you're missing here. So an outcome from these kind of events with hotels or properties coming to us and asking, okay, how can we improve upon this? We've used focus group discussions, start talking with staff, with management separately, very confidential conversations, and bringing findings and sharing with those partners and being like, okay, these are some improvements you can make. These are some management issues, maybe. These are certain things that they're requesting. See if you can invest in those. So invest in learning and development, investing in better policies, HR policies, investing in management and how to deal with staff, living quarters, etc. And we have had partners come and say, okay, we are seeing an improvement. And others who see the success of that coming to us and asking, can we replicate that? Another interesting instance was in a sector called protected agriculture, that's polytunnel farming. It's picking up and it's widely popular, especially up country in the highlands of Sri Lanka, where open field farming is becoming very difficult with climate change effects. But of course, these farmers are using open field practices in closed field protected agriculture spaces. So there is, of course, very little productivity they are gaining. There's more that can be done. And here are input providers trying to sell very expensive inputs to these farmers, but they're not willing. So here we also told the partner, fine, get some boots on the ground, talk to farmers, see what they have to say. On the sidelines, MDF did a GESI study. Now to the partner, we call this a know your customer study, and really found out who's the decision maker, who's buying the inputs, who's the knowledge carrier. And we found it's the women. When sharing this with the partner in a meeting room, he turned to his staff, field staff, and asked, is this true? Is it actually the women? And they said, yes, actually, that's the case. So really bringing what's onto the field, finding the answers from the field, from the communities, and feeding it back to the private sector has brought us significant wins. So now you have a lot of partners coming up to us and asking for that evidence-based data to really make a change in their business models, to make a change in the value chain. And with that, they identify opportunities and they are more willing to work with you. So rather than just go with the assumption of a business case, going with data can be more convincing. So yeah, those are some opportunities and some wins of many that we've had at MDF. Over to you, Holly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this. And I like both of these examples because they actually show kind of, when you embed GESI in your systems, in your research systems, in your monitoring and evaluation, you get those insights and you can share them with your partners. And I also think it's really clever how you use language like know your customers rather than talking about a GESI report. You really focused on making these insights relevant and using language that's going to resonate with your partners. And this is something, well, it didn't feature in the non-negotiables. It was a 3-part conversation series series. We had lots of great and deep conversations, and the aspect of communication was something that came out frequently. The importance of calibrating our language to the language of the private sector. We still have the same objective, but doing it in a way, some people use the term GESI by stealth, which I thought was quite clever, but we all have the same objective. We want to make sure these insights are used to the benefit of everyone. But sometimes we need to calibrate our language so that it's going to resonate with different audiences. And I think both of the examples that you shared here really speak to that. I want to ask Reema and Isuri both kind of a final question. What do we need to do this work going forward? You mentioned that the goalposts keep shifting. What's important to you as a GESI professional to keep this work, to continue to grow and build on this work? Over to you, Reema, first.
Yeah, okay. I think looking ahead, I think it's very important, especially, for Swisscontact, GESI has always been in the front. And for all the project designs, we are making sure we are looking at GESI from the beginning and not something an add-on. So this means when moving beyond saying GESI only, as I mentioned earlier, like access to service income is not enough. Economic outcomes remain important, it's important, but they're not sufficient on their own. So in all new projects, we are placing equal emphasis on social indicators from the start, including voice, agency, decision-making power, and changes in norms. So these elements need to be designed from the beginning, measures, and also tracked intentionally and not something that add later. So when we looking forward, our aim is that women and men from discriminated groups are not just beneficiaries, but they are part of the system. They are very active actors, and they should be able to influence decisions, shape services, and have their voices heard. So for us, keeping GESI as a forefront means designing programs that make this agency visible, measurable, and sustainable over the time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that actually that really characterizes what we've seen as this new frontier of GESI, as seeing these groups as actually the drivers of inclusive systems change. Thank you. Isuri, over to you.
Yes, so I think given where we see the world heading, where there is a case of the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, I think a less inclusive growth or a growing world is going to have its issues coming forward. So we as a community banging that into people's heads, I think speaking about it more vocally is going to be important in the future, even when there is this undercurrent of, is it really needed? Was it a good thing to have, or was it something just forced upon us? It's important for sustainable growth of the world, for it to be inclusive so that everyone has a fair share of the pie. And doing it right and demonstrating how it's done to the private sector is going to be more important than ever, I think. And that's the role we play.
Thank you so much for really advocating for having GESI as part of the agenda. I mean, if I'm honest, sometimes I'm even fatigued with, constantly raising that flag. But I think, what it was clear from this conversation series is we have not yet arrived. There's still work to be done, even in the most foundational things. These non-negotiables, they are foundational aspects of a program, and there's still a lot of work to be done. So I think GESI needs to continue to be part of that agenda. I want to close before we open it to Q&A, just with some of the implications for donors, for particularly donors, because I believe that donors really set the rules of the game and implementing partners respond. So with that, I wanted to share some of the key takeaways from this series. First, it's about protecting and expanding the political space for GESI. Clear signals provide legitimacy and cover for the team to engage on sensitive issues. But signaling is not really enough. Donors also shape the political space through what they reward, by backing calculated risks, supporting inclusive leaders, and standing behind programs when GESI work challenges power structures. Second, we need to invest in capabilities and culture. GESI works best when it's embedded in organizational culture, supported by dedicated expertise, as well as having broad capabilities across teams and practical tools that staff can use. Lastly, we need to prioritize flexibility and long-term investment in norm change. There are no shortcuts. This is hard work. Programs need discretionary resources, flexibilities as context shift, and a clear mandate to address norms that constrain women, people with disability, and other excluded groups. So a message for both donors and implementing partners is that inclusion remains vital to thriving, resilient market systems and requires leadership that champions this work, systems that embed it, and resources that make it possible. And donors and implementing partners have the responsibility to create the conditions which enable this work. So in closing, if I've learned one thing from the series, I learned a lot, but if I learned one thing, it is really that GESI practitioners know what is needed to do this work well. There is strong alignment on the non-negotiables, and most importantly, there's real momentum to build on. So thank you for your time, and we welcome your questions.
Well, thank you, Holly, and thank you, Isuri and Reema. That was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it's really clear. You've got some very tangible, concrete messages, and I love the 3 non-negotiables in particular. So we've started to get some questions. I would encourage everyone to put more questions into the chat. We've got 2 already, not in the chat, sorry, into the Q&A box. We've got 2 questions already to begin with, and I've also got quite a few questions that were submitted to us in the registration process to fall back on, but I'd love to kind of engage people here in the room if possible. But let's begin with the first question from Mariam Piracha, which is for you, Reema, and it really relates to that second non-negotiable, the distribution of ownership of responsibility for GESI across the program. How, she asks, did the team in your team respond to that shared ownership? Did it help to include GESI in your key performance indicators? And have you got any tips for programs who are trying to move towards a more shared ownership of the whole mission of inclusion?
Yeah, thanks, Mariam, for the question. To be honest, when we started the project, as I mentioned, it was a GESI sensitive project. We thought, because our sectors were identified with the GESI criteria. So when we started the project, being GESI neutral was enough. So that was the thought in the beginning of the first year. But we realized that's not enough. We had to do more. And when we started talking about having the shared responsibility among the team, I mean, initially the team, they had their own KPI, especially on the partnership, having more private partners as have interventions design. So there was so much focus in the intervention design that GESI was not the priority. But when we changed into the TORs, where we make sure we had some KPIs in their annual performance, and not only that, when we made sure the senior management, the sector leads were convinced on this, things moved better. It was more easy to convince the people. So initially it was more isolated with one person, but when we started working more into making it more conscious effort, having this trainings to the team, we had 2 refresher trainings, making sure everybody's on the same page. So that helped a lot. So, I mean, for the new projects, what I suggest is make sure from the beginning your teams are well versed on GESI. They have orientations on GESI, and also start them to think about when they have the initial assessment itself, and also design. GESI should always be in their mind. It should not be something they think about later. So I think this helped the team to gradually, I mean, it was not easy in the beginning because we had a full focal person who was dedicated for GESI, and they thought maybe that person will come and with interventions idea which we can add. But it took time, but later the team understood. And when we had this discussion continuously in different events, meetings, sector workshops, or sector review meetings, gradually teams started coming up with interventions where they were more inclusive. They make sure they had a section on GESI where they talked about GESI. So yeah, so it took time, but gradually the team took the ownership, and it was when we, in the middle of the project interventions, things changed, and we did have a lot of interventions where it was more inclusive. Yeah, so that's how it went.
Okay, thank you, Reema. Isuri, there's a question from Emma Finstra about the setup for MDF. I guess I was impressed by the fact that MDF was able to do a lot of research before the program was kind of nailed down. So there was a lot of flexibility and adaptability in the way that MDF works as a program. Would you like to? So our question is really, how did you convince the donor to make that possible, or what was it about the setup of MDF that enabled that kind of adaptability in the management?
Right. Thank you for your question, Emma. So just to clarify, when I mean design is design of the individual interventions within the wider project, that is MDF. At the inception of MDF, I'm not quite sure, but that design process was different. I think there would have been some initial consultations that led to and informed the design, but this I was referring to the individual projects or individual interventions that we do have within the wider program. So MDF Sri Lanka has 3 sectors. We are in tourism and as an export coffee and in agriculture. So within those sectors, we have different partnerships, different interventions that form a portfolio. And within that portfolio, we try to embed it, we mainstream inclusion into how we design. For example, if you take a portfolio in agricultural inputs, our heavy work is in fertilizer and particularly in the paddy sector, but you have these cross-cutting themes that map in with that community of paddy farmers. There is mango farming, and then there is other mechanization solutions that are attached to paddy farmers. And mechanization solutions, we have seen a lot of opportunity for farmers with disabilities or farmers of an aging population really get on to mechanization solutions to make it easy for them. We have farmers also getting into diversifying into other crops so that they don't entirely depend on paddy. So we have this portfolio approach, and our mandate is to work in these sectors, but identifying the opportunities and identifying the nuances within those sectors has been left with us. But it was just how MDF was designed from the start.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's have a fairly broad question here. From any of you who would like to address it, what are the strongest arguments that can be used to convince the private sector to engage and to adapt its offer of employment or products to women?
I can add to this, but I think I would love Isuri to take this because I feel like the examples that she had in tourism was, and it would be really illustrative and perhaps can give some more detail there.
Thanks, Holly. So like I mentioned before, it was really doing that evidence and taking that research. So for instance, we have an initial design, we'd go with the first phase, and we would sort of have these learnings from previous interventions where boots on the ground, extension officers, private extension officers, representation from the private sector company on the field talking to farmers really helps bring that visibility and get them starting to at least talk about the product and then approach. And on parallel, especially in this example with protected agriculture, we did this study and we try and identify who does what, like a level of control, level of effort. And an interesting thing we found in that was that the input provider was meeting perhaps the male member of the household who's bringing the crops, who's bringing the harvest to the town, selling it at a market, and going to the shops and buying the inputs. But what they didn't know that who came up with that list of inputs was the wife or the female member of the household, because the knowledge was sitting with her, the day-to-day management was sitting with her. Now, this is not the case across, but we found it was in most cases. And then as more lucrative an income, as the source of income becomes more lucrative, then you have more household members joining in. And showing this process, this thought process that goes behind a decision into risk, into deciding what crops, what intervals, what frequency they supply or buy, really helped inform the input provider. For instance, they were trying to get farmers to go into very high value risky crops like bell peppers or other kind of very exotic vegetables, but the farmers were really preferring to go cucumber because that they saw was less risky. But another reason why they were not diversifying into high value crops, because they didn't have access to knowledge or a source of information for them to run past or troubleshoot some concerns they're having or some pests they're seeing. So when that was provided, when the power of that knowledge was provided to the farmers, they started diversifying the crops. They started investing in more polytunnels, and they had the buy-in of the family coming in. So that was a case where you show it, yes, with data, but also with contextual storytelling, and not just one-off cases, but this is the percentage of farmers that said this. Show the full picture, what it looks like. So now they're able to sell more of those probably higher yielding but expensive inputs to the farmers, because they're seeing the results and they're seeing that risk mitigation factor being removed by working with the private sector. And now they are looking into expand into perhaps linking them with an export buyer, etc. So I think the short answer is showing the business critical value of embedding inclusion, and not even talking into inclusion. Saying that there is this opportunity, this is how the family dynamics are, maybe you should use that in how you approach your customer, and it just becomes a part of the conversation and doesn't feel like we're trying to force something on them. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I'll just add, I'll add maybe that a lot of the decision making, that happens at a household, that companies aren't aware of this. They don't know how influential women can be in certain contexts around decision making, and that when women can have more information around product and services, this empowers them to be more influential, even be further influential in decision making processes. So in the Prisma program, this is something that we also paid attention to. We shared information around household decision making processes and encouraged input companies to make a concerted effort to market and share information to both the husband and the wife, knowing that the wife was quite influential, even though they may have only seen the husband at the market or at the store. So bringing visibility to some of the more invisible people who are involved in decision making.
Okay, I've got a couple of interesting questions that are a little bit more sort of internal in a way. One is from René Chartres, who's asking about your views about the feasibility of kind of combining expertise on gender, youth, disability, ethnic minorities, etc., into one or two people, or whether it's possible necessary to spread those various skill areas around a bit. And the other question, which is sort of related, but again, is how you internally do GESI, is Dan asked a very interesting question. Where does the thinking, the ideas within a program actually about what it means within your program, where does that come from? Does it come from an external consultant coming in and giving you a load of jargon and lingos and technical advice, or is it something that gets developed organically within the team over time as they develop a kind of like a local vocabulary for what it means? Perhaps even he refers to inside jokes that kind of capture the essence of what you're trying to do with your GESI mission within your program. Sorry, I don't know whether I should ask those questions separately. They're a bit different, but I'll throw them.
I'll take the first one, and I'll possibly attempt the second one. But for the first one, I made a casual joke about how my title changed on one project about 5 different times. And reflecting back, I mean, while I was going through it, I was happy that I was continuing to have a role on this project and continuing to be able to work with the team. In hindsight, what I should have done is actually say, you know what, I know some things about disability inclusion, but I am not a disability inclusion expert. I should have pushed back on that shift in title and say, actually, we need someone who knows how to do that, who knows the specific needs of people with disability. I've certainly learned a lot, read a lot, and educated myself on this, but there was definitely the learning curve that I went up, and I think that's true for every one of the inclusion groups. And I want to be clear, I'm not against expanding the scope of inclusion. I think we need to. I think Isuri made a strong case for, increasing divergence in income across the globe is only going to create more challenges. So we need to be thinking about how we can be, more inclusive. At the same time, I also think we need to be a bit critical about the approaches that we are currently using. We discussed this a little bit in the series about how we've really tacked on. We've kind of started with women's economic empowerment and have adapted that framework for youth inclusion or youth empowerment, for disability inclusion, for other excluded groups. But we've never gone back, with a few exceptions. Some of the work that I've done with Prisma and another program, Elan RDC, and even MDF more recently for disability. But we rarely go back and say, is an adapted women's economic empowerment framework really fit for purpose for creating inclusion for these different groups? So I think we need to critically look at our approaches. At the same time, I also want to message that we can't stop the momentum. This is critical to our work. So we need to look and continue to improve our approaches as we evolve, but we also need to continue. We can't press pause and kind of do an academic exercise on how one might do this optimally. But I definitely think we need to bring in more specialized expertise and create the incentives for collaboration and identifying the areas of commonality around exclusion, but also identifying the areas where there are distinct differences. Trying to think about Dan's question. I'm not sure. One thing I will say, and then I'll bring in my colleagues to complement or to kind of pick up his question further. When I started the series, first of all, I didn't think there was 400 people who would show up. I thought there was going to be about 50. So I think it's amazing how many people really are passionate about this work and want to do more and do better. But what was also amazing is that if you ask 10 market systems development people what they think, how to describe the market systems development approach, you're going to get probably 15 different answers. And when I started this, I was nervous that if we asked all these GESI people how to do this work well, we would get all sorts of answers, and it'd be really difficult to try to make sense of it in a meaningful way. And especially as the number of signups kept on growing, I said that we're not going to be able to come out with something that's coherent. But what was resounding was the alignment around these things. These are the building blocks. These are the must-haves, the non-negotiables. This is what is needed to be able to do this work, and that's why I've termed them the non-negotiables. I think how you do that in different contexts is going to look different, but the blueprint is going to be the same.
Mm.
Yeah. Also, I just want to add to that for the last question. I think it's very important that when we talk about GESI, it's important that we know the context of the country, because what we do in Nepal may be different, very different. And so context, cultures, norms, it brings a lot of difference. So if you have an external consultant who doesn't know the context or the of the place, then I think it's very difficult to have intervention. So it's important the team knows, when you have the scoping study, when their team are in the field, they make sure what are the things they're having, what are the issues at the field level. So it's very important that the team are part of this whole assessment or knowing what's they're bringing insights from the field. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone who didn't give their name is interested in the monitoring systems and tools that you use to try and capture impact. Have you got any particular insights that you could offer?
I think I'll probably take this one. Yes, we do. So one of it is the who makes the decision and who makes the effort. We call it the LOE, LOC measurement. So that's really to try and understand the decision maker versus the effort combo in a household. To really identify that. Something we've been doing in our coffee interventions is within that community, it's very interesting. This is primarily tea communities. They are having trouble maintaining their income because the inputs are getting more expensive, the incomes are getting thin, and diversifying into coffee has been really helping them strengthen their economic well-being in the household. But what does strengthening economic well-being in a household look like? So we know vulnerability of a community really means in times of cash crunch, what are your coping mechanisms? And do you really go very down or very deep into financial trouble, or do you have access to a backup cash that can mitigate that? And we found that over the past 5 to 6 years that we've been monitoring the coffee community, we're slowly seeing the first few data collection years, it was, I'm using this money for day-to-day household management to plug in the gap in my day-to-day expenses. And with time, we've seen the farmers say, okay, I did some repairs in the house. I finished a half-built investment or started a new business. Very importantly, when a financial crisis hit in Sri Lanka in 2002, and our bread and butter, free education and free healthcare was not so accessible and was in struggle, we saw farmers say, I was able to afford private healthcare. I was afford to get private tuition for my children. So looking towards the community to see what they say first are your first indicators, in my experience. They will tell you what they are experiencing, how their lives have changed. Just have a very open conversation and try and quote that and nudge that into indicators and communicate that to your donors. So I think we sort of get ruffled in the labels and trying to identify what these indicators might be when we're setting our log frames from the start. But I think it's with time, with asking a very open-ended question at the start, identifying what those inputs are, and then quantitatively tracking it over time has been really helpful to make a picture of what that impact has looked like, and with evidence and data, communicating it back to your partners and to your donor. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah. Gosh, more questions keep coming in. I don't know if any of them jump out at you. There's a very challenging question, but perhaps there's not enough time really to get into it here. But it's about what happens when microfinance, microcredit initiatives actually risk causing increases in intimate partner violence. So in other words, I guess this is unintended consequences of initiatives that are targeting women. I don't know if any of you would like to try and address that question in 2 minutes. Yes, what recommendations to how to solve such potential problems as they arise in rural contexts.
I mean, I will take this. What I would say, I don't have the solution to that, but what I would say is that I think we know that working mainstreaming GESI is insufficient because of these systemic inequities faced by women and other people and other disadvantaged groups. So we know that we need to work to achieve systemic change, but also address the discrimination, harassment, and violence against women and other groups. But we need to do so very carefully. I think we need to not go in. I think a lot of with MSD, we say, oh, we'll pilot this, we'll try this. There's a lot of kind of energy and entrepreneurialism. And we need to bring some measure of a lot of intentionality and recognizing that there are real potential downsides. I think monitoring and evaluation has a real role here. I think often, Mel in MSD programs, when it comes to GESI, we're looking for the good stories where we tend not to want to look for the downsides. And I think here, as we start to tackle and need to tackle norm change, we need to be looking for those, the potential risks of this work. We also need to walk in with our eyes wide open and set in place mechanisms and work with private sector to put in mechanisms for accountability, feedback, so that when instances of this does show up, because it will, there's ways in which survivors can access resources. I think, we can't continue to exclude women because of that is the way that their society is structured, but we need to work within the norms, find where there's some spaces that are bending, and cautiously work to encourage more inclusion over time.
Thank you. There's a really great question from Kristin. Kristin O'Planik, who used to be obviously one of our champions in USAID. I think rather than read it out for her, I'm going to see if I can open up the mic for her. Isabel, can you give her the mic?
Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody. I really enjoyed this today. So my question, if we can acknowledge the elephant, space for this work has sharply contracted across several contexts over the last year. And I have been hearing, unfortunately, from the front lines, if you will, that since USAID's closure, many of the inclusion practices that were introduced under our programs have collapsed. Personally, I think this is just systems characteristics, right? Norms are very sticky and very hard to change. I don't think this means there's been a failure of any tactic or particular approach. So I think this is a sign to keep pushing in this moment because change is in progress, right? But are there suggestions that came out from the conversations on how to keep pushing, even in these contexts across the long term, that we need to really change those norms? Thanks.
Fantastic and an important question, and also a bit challenging. And I would agree with your characterization. This isn't a failure of the work, but it reflects the difficultness of this work. And if we, an honest accounting of our work in market systems development, majority of programs are not tackling norm change, period. Of the percentage that have taken on this, doing the twin track work, I would say they've been doing this for less than 10 years. So this is stuff that takes a lot of time and it's not linear. And I think we need more time and support. And to the person, the question around the violence associated with some of the microcredit work, we have a lot of learning to do this, but we need to be doing that learning very carefully and cautiously. One of the things, a few things that came up on the series. Well, first I'll point out to, just this, for me, what you're observing, Kristen, really speaks to the importance of leadership and leaders creating the space. So that first non-negotiable, leaders creating the space for this work and publicly endorsing it. And when you have a leader who does not do that, that has its own negative impacts. But what we also heard from the series was this idea of GESI by stealth. And some of the specific suggestions that were given was, there are a lot of technical specialists you can hire. There's a lot of MSD experts out there. There are some that will value inclusion as much as their technical expertise in market systems development. So if you're in a position of hiring, whether it's a team leader or it's intervention manager, selecting those that have that value inclusion as, and they see it as a vehicle for their work in market systems development. We have choices, and people show up when you ask the questions. You can tell who takes this work seriously and who sees this as, oh, I've got to check a box for donor because this is what's being asked of me right now. So this idea of hiring individuals who demonstrate that, yes, they have the technical chops to be an MSD expert or a climate or an energy person, but they also really value inclusion work and take it seriously. I think the other piece that came up for me in the conversation series was, again, this point around language. Before everyone joined this conversation, I was complaining about all the acronyms that we have and how I still dislike GESI. Doesn't tell me anything about the work that we do either. But it kind of is a reminder that, we have a choice around language. And we don't have to call it GESI work. We don't have to call it inclusion work. We can call it, whether it's market intelligence reports or know your customer stuff. So I think, we sometimes perhaps create distance between the work that we're trying to achieve by the language we use, and being intentional about using language that's going to grow the tent of people supporting this work. And this is something that I'm learning right now. And I picked up, the DCED at their conference, they were using language around social economic inclusion. And I think, if that's what we're calling this, great. As long as we have the space to continue to do this important work, because I believe it's essential for the systemic change objectives that we all share.
Thank you, Holly. I'm really sorry, we have run out of time, just as the conversation was getting really interesting. I want to say two things. First of all, please, could everyone fill out our little feedback form about this webinar? There's a link in the chat that Isabella's just posted. There was one final question I wanted to raise as a sort of closing question, and say thank you so much to you, all three of you, for a really fantastic presentation. Someone called Julia has said she'd love to hear about other platforms or working groups or spaces where practitioners who want to get more involved can do that. And I guess, Holly, you probably have some thoughts on what those might be. There are some links in the chat also to some more resources about this on the DCD and Beam Exchange. But yes, a sort of final question is, I mean, as I say thank you, and we do have to close. But yes, any final things you would like to say, any of you, about places, spaces, groups that people might want to follow up on as part of what they've heard today?
Maybe Reema, over to you first.
I mean, for us, I mean, we have our own internal Swisscontact GESI group, but externally, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of resources that you can find online. I mean, Canopy Lab, I know you've been doing, you have a lot of things, Beam Actions, there are lots of things. Even for NAMDP, we recently came out with a GESI and in MSD document that you can find in Beam Actions. I'll also put the link. So yeah, but yeah, I think there are other, I mean, I think Holly, you know more on this, but yeah, so there are a few places where you can get on. I mean, there have been a lot of discussion. I mean, the series that we had through the Canopy Lab was excellent for people to come and talk about this. I mean, those 3 series, I think was really great. Yeah.
Yeah. Isuri?
Yeah, so we have quite a few research papers out there. We have the Women in Work that MDF did some years back, and how we came up with the Women's Economic Empowerment Measurement Framework with 6 domains, and how we tried to put a number to movements in each domain. We've since then done a Women in Ag paper, which is where I brought the protected agriculture example from. And some of the research we've done on women in tourism are some of the examples of how we are communicating our findings. And of course, there's our LinkedIn and other social media pages of MDF, where we share a lot of our insights and learnings on this regard as well. Internally, we have our working groups. We have a working group for GESI, I think, where we meet about once a month, and then Palladium, a contractor as a whole. We have a community of we meet up and discuss this from a male perspective as well. Yeah, and I think LinkedIn has been a good place to really pick up the language and pick up insights and ideas that everyone has been throwing around. And yes, of course, Canopy Lab and that conversation series was a real eye opener as to how many people are in the community as well. Like Holly mentioned, we didn't realize we were such a big community to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to try to end on a positive note, but one of the many unfortunate things with the dismantling of USAID is we really lost a lot of these spaces for coming together. There was a fantastic community of practice, as well as space to share resources. And I maybe want to appeal to any people who have the resources to think about animating some sort of community of practice, because I do think this is, a lot of organizations do this internally, but that public space is critical. And there is a real gap right now. And we know from the conversation series that this knowledge sharing is essential for us to get better and smarter at this work, because we need to. So maybe I'll close there and say thank you, Mike, for this opportunity and allowing us to keep GESI on the agenda. And we hope to continue to see it in future events and conferences. And we'll put a link to the research that we did. And yeah, thank you everyone who joined us, and particularly to Reema and Isuri for sharing their experiences. And as always, to the Beam Exchange and the DCED for supporting this work.
You're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure, and I will say there is a stream in the agenda for the DCED Global Seminar in June about these kind of issues. So please check that out. I'll maybe Isabel can pop a link to the announcement about the event in the chat now. But anyway, thank you. Yes, please fill out the feedback form before you go. Have a great day, and see you again at the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.